Welcome, everyone. My name is Chris Daly. I am a professor of journalism at Boston University, and I am delighted to be talking to you today about the history of journalism in the United States in a talk I call Covering America. The very first newspaper in English in the New World is seen here in replica. This is the Boston Newsletter. This is a small document. It's not much, the whole paper wasn't much bigger than this. But it is packed with things that we can learn from and take as a starting point. So first of all, the name suggests that, yes, indeed, it was published here in Boston, where I am, and it was meant to be a weekly newspaper. And very importantly, there in the second line, if you can see this clearly on the screen, in that Gothic lettering, it says, published by authority. That's a key phrase because it signals that this newspaper was printed with the approval of the powers that be, of the royal governor here in Massachusetts. And if that were not the case, then it would have been subject to censorship. At least one other paper had been tried before this and was promptly put out of business after a single edition. So this is the starting point of the first newspaper that ever got out more than one issue, and that's because it was presented to the public by someone with a lot of rank in the local establishment. In fact, the publisher of this newsletter, John Campbell, was also the postmaster for Boston, which was the biggest port and the biggest city in English North America. So if we're talking about the colonies here on the East Coast, there in the early 18th century, Boston was a kind of a natural place based on population and all the rest to launch a venture like this. And when I think about what John Campbell did there in 1704, I like to call that Plan A in American journalism. And we can see that it lasted for a good bit of the 18th century. It really amounted to something very simple, which I call a philosophy of don't rock the boat. And what that means to me is that these early papers, which were printed by people who were actually in the printing business and brought out newspapers as a sideline, they were very aware that these were small businesses in an outpost of the empire. They had no possibility of going to bat or going to war against the powers that be. They were no match, in other words, for church or state. They had to be very circumspect about what they put in their paper for contents. So these newspapers tended to be very small. After the Boston Newsletter, others were formed in bigger cities up and down the East Coast of North America. They were always locally distributed and very expensive. They were priced on the scale of what we might pay today for like an investment newsletter, costing thousands of dollars a year to subscribe to. And that was because this was targeted at an audience that could afford it. Mainly merchants, lawyers, ship captains, ministers, and they were interested in keeping up with certain things that mattered to them. They wanted to know the price of iron ore, let's say, in Sweden. They wanted to know the latest proclamations from the governor of their own colony or new acts of parliament, things that would affect business, things that were important enough to pay for and to pay, significant amounts of money for. Beyond that kind of thing, most newspapers were filled with letters written by the printer's friends. Poems were very important, space fillers, sermons written and delivered by the local clergy, and the text of acts of, let's say, the Great and General Court of Massachusetts. So these were things that people in the colonial elite needed to be conversant with. And that's why the Boston Newsletter, as you can see, was packed full of densely, tightly spaced columns of print They were trying to squeeze a lot of valuable information into a short amount of space. I just mentioned one other thing about this first paper, and that is, if you can see there, the very first item is attributed to the London Flying Post. That is a newspaper published in London. This was lifted from that other newspaper. This is news that we might say charitably today was aggregated from another source. And a reason for that is that none of these newspapers in the early phases here in America had anybody with the role of news reporter. No one was collecting news, gathering news, reporting. We'll get to that in a little bit, but for now, a lot of this material was lifted or official, or it just came into the hands of the printer / editor through his friends. Also note, this is a fun fact, that very first edition of that newspaper, the first item from London, was dated December 3rd, 1703. Now, this newspaper is coming out in April 1704. And the reason for that is that it was very dangerous to try to sail across the North Atlantic Ocean in the wintertime. So a city like Boston, as big and important as it was as a colonial outpost, was isolated all winter. There were no ships coming or going from across the ocean to Europe. So in springtime, newspapers here would be catching up with the old news from the previous December. And the printers would ration that out. They would catch up slowly and bring readers eventually up to date, rather than jump into the latest news and squander all the news that came off the ships as they arrived in April. They would have a big, load of newspapers, one, from each week of the prior winter. In any case, we might also take a look at how newspaper editors thought of themselves during this period from no less a source than Ben Franklin. When Ben was a teenager, he was apprenticed to his older brother, James, who was a printer who ran a newspaper in Boston. And James was always getting in trouble and occasionally getting arrested and put in jail. And Ben would sometimes have to take over the running of the newspaper. And he boiled down his sense of what the work was like in this way. Be very general in your writings. And when you condemn any vice, do not point out any particular persons. So, we might paraphrase that to say, look, if you want to go on a campaign against corruption, venality, Sabbath breaking, and so on, you can certainly do that, but don't name names. Don't call out anybody, particularly, of course, anybody with any sort of power or position in the establishment. So this is the starting point. This is the kind of news media that the country began with. But no surprise, it didn't stay that way for very long. As these colonies got bigger, as more wealth developed in the New World, as there was more demand for printing and more demand for information, newspapers got to be bigger. In the biggest cities, they actually got to be a little competitive. You would sometimes have more than one in the same city. And they started to really thrive. We can see here a glimpse inside one of these 18th century newspapers. This is a wonderful illustration that shows the three principal figures who you'd find in any one of these shops. On the left is the journeyman, but I want to start in the middle with the master. The master was the person who had all the skills of this trade and the capital to set up shop for himself, to buy a building, to house it, and to house his family, to buy the very expensive printing equipment, and also very expensive metal letters, I'll get to in a second, and the very expensive paper. All of those things cost a lot of money. And so that's part of the reason that newspapers were priced so high, is that the printer had a lot of overhead that he had to recoup. On the left, you can see a figure of the journeyman. The journeyman was a young man who would have all the skills of the trade, because he'd been an apprentice for a long time, but he didn't yet have the capital to go out on his own. And you can see what the journeyman is doing there is pulling these tiny little letters, metal letters cast at a foundry in England, taking them out of that box or case, as they called it, and assembling them in a little metal frame, making a word at a time and a row at a time before moving on to add more and more and more, build up eventually whole sentences and paragraphs. And as the journeyman was composing on his compositor stick, he would pick a letter as needed from each case. The top case on the far left there, the upper case, in other words, had the capital letters in it. So he would grab an uppercase letter as needed, and then a lowercase letter from the other boxes down below. When he had enough, he would take that across the room where, as you can see on the far right, the apprentice is assembling those lines of type inside a metal frame. When that was full, it would be locked, and then ink could be applied to the top of it, and then paper could be pressed down on top of the inked metal letters. Very labor-intensive, slow process, slowed down even further by the fact that the ink didn't dry very quickly. So if you see in this image at the very top, there's some stuff hanging there that looks like laundry. Those are not shirts. Those are the sheets of paper that have been inked and are waiting to dry to the point where they can be folded on themselves or stacked without smudging and sticking together. This is one reason why most newspapers for a long time came out only once a week. It was a very laborious process of setting the type, pressing it onto the press, and getting the paper to dry. And here, the final step would be laying that flat inked bed of letters onto the press itself, putting a piece of paper in there, and then pressing with muscle power down onto the inked bed. Very strenuous, difficult work. Now, over the course of this 18th century, printers got a little bolder in what they were willing to try to place in their columns, and they began to develop a new philosophy that I call Plan B here in American journalism. And the emphasis here is on a concept that we might usefully call the open press. And here again, Ben Franklin is a good example of this. By the 1730s, he owned his own newspaper in Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania Gazette. And in the pages of the Pennsylvania Gazette, he exemplified this new idea, but also argued for it in a quite articulate essay called Apology for Printers. And what he was saying there is that the public would be better served if the pages of a newspaper were open to multiple points of view, and that this would not only not threaten society, but it would actually serve society. And here again, he presented some advice to other editors and to the public. In 1731, he wrote this essay, Apology for Printers, that carries this critical phrase and philosophical statement. He says there that printers are educated in the belief that when men differ in opinion, both sides ought equally to have the advantage of being heard by the public, and that when truth and error have fair play, the former is always an overmatch for the latter. So, this is essentially the idea behind the modern op-ed page in a newspaper. That is, let's publish a whole bunch of different points of view. We'll let readers decide. In other words, let truth and error have fair play. Get before the public. Have equal access to readers, and let readers figure it out, confident that truth will win out in the end. Now, to a lot of us, this may sound like a very reasonable and well-reasoned point of view, but I need to emphasize that in the 18th century, this was a very subversive stance for Franklin to take, for the simple reason that he's suggesting this is a new pathway to truth. We'll let truth come from the fair exchange of ideas. But that's not how this issue was seen by the powers that be. In fact, the monarchy and the Church of England and their counterparts all over, the world, really, emperors and popes and bishops and all sorts of people who were used to exercising power, they understood this issue very differently. From their point of view, truth came from above, and truth was imparted to people. And the idea that you would let people just like think for themselves and figure stuff out and let false points of view be published, all of that was heresy and dangerous and a threat to the stability of the existing power structure. And of course, the colonial governors could see this. Members of parliament could see this when these newspapers from America came across the ocean and news from America arrived in London. And they were quite distraught about all this, but they found themselves in a very difficult position. It was very hard for them to actually crack down on these newspapers in these remote locations. Furthermore, the colonists came up with a kind of a workaround to make sure that their views could be heard without having to be held accountable for them. And they started to print a lot of kinds of publications known generally as pamphlets. These were one-off publications where someone would present a highly political point of view, but not printed in a regularly published newspaper. These would be people who might be lawyers or wealthy farmers or anybody from any walk of life who had a political argument they wanted to make, would pay a printer, or maybe that if that printer sympathized with this point of view, the printer might do it for free under cover of dark, print up a couple of hundred of these pamphlets, give it back to the author, and the author could then circulate them. And these authors, were not taking too many chances. They would always publish these anonymously or under a pseudonym, often picking names from the ancient Greek or Roman republics, with the idea that this would be a good, sort of amusing handle to use in pushing these ideas, especially anything that had to do with questioning the power of the monarchy or the authority of the church. And these pamphlets proved to be very effective in ramping up the political thinking that was going on in the colonies and in polarizing public opinion, so that by the 1750s and 60s, you start to see emerging groups of people here in the New World who are either rebels or Tories. That is, either they are thinking about independence, questioning the structure of society, or they are traditionalists and loyalists and they want to stick up for the king and the church. And it's fascinating to see how this process plays out both in the official, in regular newspapers, but also in these pamphlets, which are more like, posting something on Twitter or putting something on Facebook, especially if you're using a fake handle to stay out of trouble. And things become very heated here, not too long a time. Here's one of the first political cartoons ever published in the colonies. This was drawn by no less than Ben Franklin. Here again, he is in the 1750s, urging the colonies to unite, not against Great Britain yet, but this was to unite in their common defense against the French in Canada, to the north and west, and their Native American allies. But this same cartoon would be repurposed a few years later in newspapers that were supporting the movement for independence from Great Britain. We can also see in this escalating movement toward greater and greater political debate and toward the expression and articulation of more seriously subversive ideas, we finally get to about what I would say is Plan C around the year 1765. And I mention that year because that was a year that Parliament made a big mistake and passed something called the Stamp Act, which imposed the stamp tax, which was effectively a tax on the use of paper. Paper was itself very expensive, and then to be taxed on top of that meant that paper was now going to be a luxury item. And of course, that tax fell most heavily on people who used paper in their trades, and that, of course, was the printers and newspaper editors. So they didn't like this at all. And they started to think, where did this tax come from? Why are we being taxed? We didn't even have a say in that parliamentary act. And that is something that because it falls so heavily on printers, it tends to radicalize them, more and more of them. Drop this idea of neutrality, even the idea of having an open press, and instead they begin to demand what we can see goes under the heading of a free press. That is, they demand the right to be free to promote one point of view in their newspaper week after week after week. And they don't, and they make the subsidiary argument that, look, if someone wants to get a different point of view, they can buy a different paper. This, of course, is an argument that makes more sense later in the 18th century, as a growing number of cities have more than one newspaper published locally, or where the post office is now working effectively enough so that anybody could get access to more than one newspaper, or a newspaper published far away if they chose to. And what we see here emerging is the beginnings of what I refer to as the advocacy tradition in American journalism. The idea that a newspaper and the practice of journalism exists to change the world. And these editors are, furthermore, they're asking that, that the powers that be don't shoot the messenger, don't put us out of business, don't suppress these points of view, and understand that society is best served by having access to different ideas. They're just going to come from a newspaper that has a consistent point of view. And we can see how between 1765 and the actual shooting war that breaks out in 1775, the evolution of these more and more radical and polarized opinions in the colonies. I would point you to this great quote from John Adams. This is contained in a letter that he wrote late in his life to his friend Thomas Jefferson. The two old men now were looking back at the Revolutionary period, and Adams asks rhetorically, what do we mean by the Revolution? The war? Question mark. He's saying, you mean the shooting part? No, he says, that was no part of the Revolution. It was only an effect and consequence of it. The Revolution was in the minds of the people. And in that letter, he goes on to say to Jefferson, of course, the place to look for evidence of that revolution, the record of it, is in the newspapers and pamphlets of that period, 1765 or so, up to the beginning of the shooting. And so when we do that, we can see, how beginning there in 1765, newspaper editors started to see themselves as victims of this colonial regime. Here we see a newspaper also published in Pennsylvania by a rival to Ben Franklin, editor William Bradford. And he set up his front page after the stamp tax in the image of a tombstone, saying, this is it, the end of media. This is, newspapers are going to have to go out of business because this tax is so onerous. He was, of course, exaggerating a little bit, and newspapers kept publishing. They printed some wonderful cartoons during this period, including the one that we can see there on the left, showing how the colonists treated a tax collector. This poor fellow is being doubled over backwards. He's already been tarred and feathered, and now he is having oil poured down his throat. And he's standing under the Tree of Liberty. And in the background there, you could see some of the colonists tossing tea into the harbor. This was a very incendiary kind of imagery. And there on the right, you could see a fantastic cartoon in which Britain, on the left, in the red formal dress and high hair, is doing battle with the image of America there on the right, the colonies in the New World, dressed as a Native American. And the British figure is saying, if you can see what's coming out of her mouth, her voice bubble there is saying, "I'll force you to obedience, you rebellious slut." And the figure representing the New World is answering, "Liberty, liberty, forever, mother, while I exist." And this is indicative of how the thought processes and feelings and loyalties in the colonies were diverging and moving away from any kind of consensus toward a more polarized and radical separation. Here we can see an image that was widely reprinted in the colonies about the Boston Massacre of 1770, right in this period of radicalization, polarization. And this is an early work of propaganda, because it does show something that happened. I mean, it's based on something true, but it is very selective in its details and very dramatically ramping up the emotional content of what happened there when these British soldiers did indeed fire on a group of Bostonians. What it doesn't show is that seconds before this, the mob there in Boston was throwing snowballs and ice balls at the soldiers. But we see them blasting away at these unarmed civilians, just barely missing the little dog at the bottom, which is quite a poignant, detail. Noteworthy here that this image was engraved on copper by the coppersmith Paul Revere, the famous Paul Revere. And then those plates could be copied and shipped around the colonies to other newspapers so that this image could be reproduced and was seen by a good number of people. Now, all of this polarization comes to a climax here in the winter of 75, 76, crucial moment when the great polemicist of this era, Thomas Paine, published his pamphlet, Common Sense, in which he makes two arguments. He says, we have to separate from Great Britain. It's too late to even think about not doing that. They're already so mad at us that there's no turning back. And so when we are independent, what kind of society do we want? And here he's proposing a really radical reshaping of society. He would like to get rid of the monarchy, the British aristocracy, the whole package of inherited titles and entailed property, the kind of problem you see in Downton Abbey. He's saying, let's get rid of all that. Let's be free and equal citizens, and we will solve our own problems. We will govern ourselves in a republic. And that indeed is the big project of the American Revolution. It combines those two ideas, independence and a republic. They didn't have to go together, could have had one without the other, but in fact, that was the message that prevailed, thanks in large degree to those newspapers and pamphlets of that crucial period between 1765 and 1775. Now, in case you're thinking, well, that's great, all's well, all our problems are taken care of. In fact, once the new government got set up here, following the enactment of the Constitution and the assembling of the first Congress and all of this, we could see a brand new kind of journalism beginning almost immediately and capturing most of the newspapers in the new independent United States. And this is a kind of press that can only be described as partisan. And it was at least as partisan as you may think the press is today. And we might call this Plan D. We're already on to the fourth, sort of rethinking of what newspapers and media should be. This partisan press is a reflection, but also a cause of very significant divides in the way people were thinking there in the 1790s and into the early part of the 19th century. To make a long story short, the idea was that there was a falling out between a group or faction, as they would have said, led by Alexander Hamilton on the one hand, and another faction led by Thomas Jefferson. And if you've seen the musical Hamilton. You can see this most clearly in the cabinet battle. There's two parts of it in the play, in the musical, in which Hamilton and Jefferson are actually going at each other quite vigorously. And Hamilton is making the classic case for a big government. He wants a federal government that is strong and well-funded through taxation and able to do things that would stimulate commerce, that would make the country more prosperous and better defended. So he wants to see a federal government that can do things like build a new network of lighthouses to help stimulate commerce, or build bridges that would allow for the faster flow of goods and people. And Jefferson is saying, no, 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 that's not what we had in mind. That's not why we fought a revolution. We want liberty. We want low taxes. We want a government that is weak as we can get away with. And so around these two men and these philosophies, and egged on in part by newspapers, there becomes this movement of forming permanent groups that will reflect these persistent differences, and newspapers that will support and amplify the arguments on both sides. And in fact, Hamilton and Jefferson are both responsible directly or indirectly for helping to invest in and found newspapers during this period. Hamilton was a founder of the New York Post, the one that's still in business today as a right-wing tabloid. It began as a newspaper supporting that Federalist philosophy, while Jefferson had a hand in creating some other newspapers that were anti-Federalist, or as they later became known, Republicans. Now, another crucial thing that happens, of course, in this period is that right after the Constitution is adopted, there's a series of amendments that help to make the country safe for the expression of all kinds of views. The bulwark of that kind of liberty of thought and its expression is, of course, the First Amendment. The part of it that pertains to journalism says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press. Wow. There you have, I mean, there's about as straightforward a statement as you could ask for, telling the government, keep your hands off all printed material. And of course, this is written in 1790 at a time when printing was the only form of mass communication. You could arguably construe this to mean Congress shall never make any law abridging the freedom of all the media, then known and yet to be invented. But in any case, this is the starting point there in 1790. And we might say, well, great, problem solved. Everybody can, say what they want. Well, in fact, that it didn't work out quite that way. There were, as I've mentioned, these factions in Congress and in the state governments. And they, as you can see in this image, went at each other, literally almost hammer and tongs. I mean, one member of Congress here is shown on the floor using a fireplace tongs to attack a fellow member who's fighting back with a cane. Things got very hot. They got so hot that by the end of that very first decade of our existence as a country, the Federalist majority in Congress, a narrow majority, exploited that advantage to pass a law called the Sedition Act. This made it a crime to criticize the government. Nice, nice thing if you're in the majority. And of course, the Federalist president, John Adams, signed that law, infuriating Jefferson and his supporters in the anti-Federalist movement, because soon the editors who supported them, the critics of the government, started being arrested, charged under this Sedition Act, and put in jail. Now, this was a really crucial crisis for the First Amendment, the meaning of the peaceful sharing and transitions of power. It was a very almost existential challenge to the whole idea of the United States. And things indeed got very hot. Federalists fought back and printed cartoons like this one showing Jefferson as a kind of a rooster who can't stay away from the dark-skinned Sally Hemings, who's depicted here. I'm happy to report that that Sedition Act passed out of existence 2 years later and was not repeated for quite a while. Eventually, we're going to come to a major turning point here in the 1830s. Let me talk about that for a minute, and then we'll see how this shapes the modern experience that we have of the news media. Because in 1833, a man named Benjamin Day had an idea. Here he is, and here's an image from his newspaper. Benjamin Day in 1833 had the idea that he could sell papers very cheaply, but if he sold a lot of them to a lot of people, that would add up to a fair amount of money. And indeed, that's what he did with his newspaper that he called The Sun. And he wanted the sun to, as he put it, shine for all. He wanted to reach all the middling classes, working classes, and the upper classes as well in New York City. Essentially, anyone who could read English was his target audience. And so he priced his paper at a penny a day, which was unheard of. And he published every day of the week, except for Sundays. And so he was trying to reach everyone, pricing it very low. And he set himself the further challenge that people didn't have to subscribe to his paper. You could buy it today. If it sounded interesting, you could skip it tomorrow if you either didn't have a penny or if the headlines didn't look that exciting. So in effect, he's challenging himself to, for the first time, make his paper interesting every day to everybody. A fantastically complicated process. And because he priced it at 1 cent per copy, this idea, this philosophy style became known as the penny press. And it also entailed one other major innovation. If he was going to present amazing facts every day to regular people that they could grasp pretty quickly, it had to be cheap, it had to be popular, and it had to have information in it. For that, he had to turn to reporting. And this is the start of what I call the reporting tradition. In fact, Day hired the world's first reporter that I can find, a full-time person named George Wisner, whose job was to go out into the city and find stuff out, bring back interesting facts to the newsroom, as you can see there in the bottom left. This is the first time that newspapers do this. They invent this role of reporter in order to have amazing content every day. And so Wisner and his successors were sent out to the docks in New York City Harbor to find newly arriving ships or interesting information, rumors from other places. They would be sent to police court to keep track of crimes. And they often were involved in covering fires in the city of New York. New York was a tightly packed city of wooden buildings, lots of people using fire every day for cooking, heating, and such. And it was always burning down. Whole neighborhoods would be taken out in these conflagrations. And Day's newspaper would be there documenting it. And soon enough, this became so successful that it invited competition. And the next thing we know, a rival, James Gordon Bennett, began bringing out the New York Herald. Same idea, same business plan. And what he noticed was that this was so profitable that newspapers now did not need any subsidies from the political parties. They could separate themselves from the parties. He also declared that now his newspaper and Day's were being read by more people than had voted in the last election for governor, for mayor, even for president of the United States. These papers were now themselves a political force. And he declared his independence from the political parties, saying, "We will not be the organ of any faction. Instead," he says, "we shall endeavor to record facts on every public and proper subject, stripped of verbiage and coloring, with comments when suitable." So he's reserving the right to editorialize, and in fact, setting himself up here as a judge of the performance of public officials. He will not automatically support or oppose any particular party. Instead, these new penny press papers are going to be more like umpires, and we'll call them as we see them, and we'll point out good things and we will condemn bad things. These newspapers get much bigger physically, many more readers every day. They start publishing tens of thousands of copies. And they get a little carried away. Honestly, the New York Sun was guilty of perpetrating this tremendous hoax in which they published pictures of life that they said they had discovered on the moon, and never actually apologized for that. All of this really ramped up late in the 19th century with the coming of what is sometimes called the yellow press, or a sensationalist version. It's pretty much the penny press on steroids. This was in the hands of William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. They were the first ones to reach the mythical, legendary, like million copies a day mark. They were selling 1 million papers a day by the late 1890s. And they threw a lot of different new ideas at the essential problem that Day and Bennett had created, which was how to keep masses of people interested in stuff day after day after day. One way they did that, this is Joseph Pulitzer's reporter, Nellie Bly. She became the most famous journalist of this period. He paid for her to go on a trip around the world to see if it would be possible in real life to beat the newly articulated ideal of getting around the world in 80 days from the novel by Jules Verne. Well, this plucky reporter with that fabulous coat and that tiny little bag set off around the world and documented, of course, at each stop, sending back by telegraph reports to Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, and captivating the audience with her adventures and the race against the clock. She eventually made it back to the West Coast of the US with a couple of days to spare. Pulitzer had chartered a train that was standing by with flags up in front of the locomotive and raced across the country, and in fact got her back to New York 77 days after she had set out. Now, Hearst and Pulitzer were criticized in their day for exaggerating the news, for hyping it, for using every trick in the book to make things sound more amazing than they actually were. Here they are being criticized by the wonderful turn of the century magazine Puck in their edition called The Cleaning of New York. Pulitzer on the left and Hearst on the right are being addressed by the law. But nothing really slowed them down. They were sending these newsboys out into the streets every day to hawk the most amazing headlines, sometimes, bordering on fake news, humbug. This is a wonderful cartoon here of William Randolph Hearst. He's shown there in the red costume in the center as a jester, taking these sensational headlines and tossing them to the masses. They're shown in the lower right. And you can see, perhaps in some of these newspapers, the headlines are things like appeals to passion, venom, attacks on honest officials, sensationalism, strife. They're being faulted here for always, stirring the pot and exaggerating the facts. And if we look at, for example, this is ultimate example, perhaps. New York Journal there on the left is Hearst's paper. On the right is one of its rivals, the New York Times, which had begun existence in 1851. They're reporting on the same events on the same day. The New York Times covers the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor in one column over there on the far right, whereas Hearst gives his whole newspaper front page over to it, assumes that that he's got the right cause figured out, that it was the work of an enemy of the US, in other words, Spain, trying to whip up support for getting America to go to war with Spain. He's offering his own money there as a reward. He notes that Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Teddy Roosevelt, is convinced that the explosion was not an accident, and trying to generate more and more war fever. In this case, Hearst and Pulitzer were both ridiculed and criticized for playing like children at war, Here you could see them looking like little kids playing with their blocks, and the result being war for all the rest of us. So the irresponsibility of newspapers is a recurring theme and issue. But I want to also mention some of their contemporaries and then look at the 20th century in the time we have left. Back around the beginnings of the 20th century, there was a very different contemporary philosophy of journalism, and that's the one known as muckraking. This is the idea that journalists can use their skills to expose the bad parts of society, the faults, not just crimes, but despicable conditions. We'll see some of this in just a minute. They had a kind of a headquarters in New York City at a magazine called McClure's. One of the managing editors was Ida Tarbell, famous muckraker of this period, also Lincoln Steffens and many others. They worked hand in glove with the progressive movement in politics in that time, because the whole idea of muckraking, I think the thing that sets it apart was not just that they wanted to sell newspapers or magazines by exposing shocking conditions. The idea was you expose and that leads to reform. That was their motivating factor, that they were going for improving society. So we could see, the kind of photographs and cartoons. Here's a wonderful cartoon illustrating the work of Ida Tarbell, who was exposing Standard Oil and its founder, John D. Rockefeller. And you can see there's an oil tank in the center of this image, but it sort of melds into an image of a very dangerous octopus that is sending its tentacles out around the whole country. And you can see there on the left that one tentacle is already wrapped around the US Capitol. Another one on the far right is wrapped around the state capitals. One is slithering over at the bottom to capture the White House. And it shows this, relentless, inescapable force that is threatening corruption of the institutions that are supposed to protect us. Also, it would bring high prices. I think today this would also it'd be a more a show of carbon pollution. But suffice to say, this was a pretty scary image. At the same time, other muckrakers were exposing problems like child labor, lynching, the corruption of municipal governments. And we have a wonderful statement from one of the leading muckrakers, Ray Stannard Baker, who said why they did this. He said, "We muckraked not because we hated our world, but because we loved it." And I like that quote because I think deep down, from my research, I gather that a lot of these people were quite idealistic and very disappointed that the industrializing, urbanizing America they were living through wasn't living up to its highest ideals. Now, when we come to the 20th century, we see a very different way of thinking about journalism emerge. And a lot of this is driven by the rise of broadcast news. That, of course, has to be carried, but through some medium. And we can see some crucial turning points here. In 1927, radio becomes a very popular commercial way of communicating, competes very well with the mass circulation, big city daily newspapers of the period. And then after World War II, the other form of broadcasting that becomes so popular, of course, is television. And in this new world of broadcast news, we can see a whole new business model. These are private corporations, and they're very profitable, but they are regulated by the federal government. The Federal Communications Commission is brought into life in this period to oversee radio and television, writes all kinds of rules about what they can and cannot do, censors content, all sorts of things. For our purposes, a very important step that the FCC takes is the licensing of all broadcasting, and the requirement in those license agreements that they have to be renewed, and that the holder of the license has to be able to prove that he or she has been operating in the public interest. no one, of course, was quite sure at the birth of broadcasting what that might mean. One thing they figured out, a way to meet that standard, was to provide news over the air. So in these giant, early radio boxes, listeners could hear news over the air. A fantastic step toward public communication. But the problem was that if these radio stations wanted to keep their licenses, they had to demonstrate to the FCC that they were being responsible. And they, of course, wanted those licenses to be renewed. They were very valuable. So they hit upon a style or manner of philosophy of journalism that became known as objectivity. And this was something like a cloak of invisibility or a secret sauce that they could use to satisfy the government regulators, to satisfy the public, and to prevent further polarization or radicalization of American political philosophy. The idea here being that this would be a centrist, fact-based form of imparting the news to the greatest number of people with the least amount of problems and pushback and criticism. And you can see this in the emergence of television, certainly, where the early presidential debates here are being organized and moderated by television producers. On the right, the famous image of Walter Cronkite became the most trusted man in America through this objective style of journalism. It was also the favorite of the more responsible print press, like the New York Times and Time magazine, once that got going in the 1920s, and became really the dominant form and philosophy of news gathering in America all through the middle part of the 20th century, into the Cold War, and well into the very last years of the 20th century. If we want to just take a quick look ahead, we're on another plan now, thanks largely to the internet, where the distribution of news has now become digitized and makes it possible for people to survive economically, people in the news business, with smaller audiences. And audiences, indeed, since the rise of the internet and the World Wide Web in 1995 or so, those audiences have splintered into smaller groups, giving rise to problems like echo chambers and hyperpartisanship, where people just listen to news that reinforces their own inclinations or biases. And this, of course, has also led to the rise of actually intentional fake news. It's a shame in a way, because the internet was the invention of some very nice people who never in their wildest nightmares saw this happening. On the left there, you can see an early cartoon of some of the founding inventors of the structure, the infrastructure, you might say, of the internet. There's a schematic drawing there on the right that shows how some of those early nodes in the internet were really connecting big computers at universities, so that researchers at MIT and UCLA and places in England could share data. They never pictured it as a system of worldwide propaganda, commerce, disinformation, and the like. One other inadvertent result of the rise of the internet, of course, has been the decline in print journalism. And actually, this is a stand-in for all kinds of the traditional 20th century news media. They have all lost ground and they've all lost money in recent years. It turns out that Facebook and Google are much better advertising platforms than newspapers or magazines or broadcast news. And so we are in a period now of tremendous transition to a whole new way of thinking about the media. And here we have a wonderful sort of view from 30,000 feet of the way news media have become more and more partisan, and how some have become more credible and some have become much, much less credible as they become more partisan. And I think the driver of this is several-fold, but a very important part of that is the rise of the internet and the desire of many, many people to find news that they find congenial, that reinforces the way they felt this morning is the way they want to feel this afternoon, only more so. So with that, I think what we can expect to see in the future, although that's not my field, but looking ahead, I would say we can see the continuation of a lot of these trends and a further evolutionary process at work, where the business model and the reigning philosophy of journalism will continue to evolve in new and perhaps unexpected ways.